Barnaby Jones will return next Thursday night at 10, 9 Central and Mountain on most of these stations.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
I remember when The Dark Knight Returns came out. I remember when Watchmen came out. So, of course, I remember when Kingdom Come came out.
Kingdom Come is 4 separate issues, 48 pages apiece. It was an all-immersive kind of lifestyle for me.
It blew people away. I mean, this was the most sought-after book there was.
This was something very new, very different.
No one had seen anything like that at that scale before.
It was amazing.
I never thought from anything people would still be talking about this book 25 years later.
Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Always happy to welcome Garth Ennis back to Word Balloon. Always a good conversation. Great to see you, man. How you been?
Pretty good, John. And it's nice to be back. How are you?
I'm doing all right, man. Doing all right. Enjoying some fine Garth Ennis comics lately, and some atypical work. I'm gonna put a cover up of one of the things we're going to talk about, and that is the series you got from AHOY. Boy, I'm really glad you hooked up with AHOY, Garth. I really think they're doing very, very funny comics, and it's nice to see you have a project over there.
Yeah, I mean, they're old friends, Tom Pyre and Stuart Moore. We go back 30 plus years, which is terrifying, of course, when you're in your mid 50s and you're thinking about your early 20s. But Stuart was my first editor on Hellblazer and Preacher. Tom was working for DC and what would become Vertigo at the time, so we were all good friends, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And when AHOY came about, it was lovely to be able to take a project there and work with them.
That's great, man. Here, let's see if this works. There we go. Is it up there? Yeah. There's the cover to the first issue of Babs, everybody. Babs, a fun comedy, kind of in the vein of Red Sonja, but certainly funnier than Red Sonja. What made you think of Babs, and how did this come about?
It was a couple of things. A few years ago, I found myself writing Hawk the Slayer for Rebellion.
Sure.
In the UK, a comic book sequel to the greatest sword and sorcery movie of all time. 1980, that well-known subgenre, English fantasy. But much as I might ridicule the notion, and much as I occasionally do look down on the idea of sword and sorcery, because it can be such a lazy genre as fantasy genres like science fiction, like superheroes can be, because they rely so heavily on just making stuff up and avoiding the real world. Much as I do sometimes look down on notions like that, the ideas can get in your head and then they won't leave you alone. And you find yourself running scenes, characters, even lines of dialogue through your head and thinking, I reckon I've got something here. And that's what happened with Babs. I didn't mean to write a sword and sorcery comic. I don't know much about Red Sonja beyond the basic idea of her being a wandering barbarian woman in a chainmail bikini, whatever. But the idea of it is ripe to be explored, and that's what I found myself doing with Babs. I suppose, in a nutshell, you might say if someone as unlike your typical sword and sorcery characters ended up in a sword and sorcery story, that's what you get with Babs.
Yeah, it's kind of Sex in the City in the Iberian age. Again, I know you're doing your own thing here, but yeah, I mean, and especially what is Babs's woman friend, woman friend's name again?
Izzy, the charioteer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They have great conversations that could be, in movie, things like Sex in the City or Diner or whatever. They just happen to be talking about orcs and goblins and other warriors and things.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. I mean, that happens to be the job they do, but they could be doing anything and they would still meet up once every 6 months and just chat about how they're getting on. That idea you had, that wizard you were going to rob, that dragon whose hoard you were going to steal. How's it all been going? Well, not so well. I mean, probably what they share more than anything else, even their wandering barbarian status, is their really bad luck. Is that whatever they try to do, and Babs is an absolute champion at this, whatever they try to do will go wrong somehow.
Jason Burrows is your artist?
Yeah, Jason Burrows.
Yeah, how'd you get together on this?
Well, he and I have been working together for 20 plus years. We go right back to 303, a series we did at Avatar, followed by Wormwood, followed by Crossed, a couple of Punisher series, the Ribbon Queen last year for AWA. And he just seemed the obvious choice. When I started coming up with Babs, I knew it would be quite a funny story. One of the things I find very important when you're writing humor is clarity of storytelling, because there's going to be a lot of visual gags in there.
Sure.
And I don't want muddy, unclear art. I want someone who is showing you exactly what is intended. Jason's an absolute master of that. One of my favorite series, I just happened to be talking to him recently, is the horror series he did with Alan Moore at Avatar, Providence. It was immediately preceded by Neonomicon. But together they make up, I think, a modern classic. And what Alan and Jason did there, what Jason was able to do with Alan's story was something very special. Anyway, when the time came to put Babs together, really Jason was the only man for the job.
This is this a finite series? What's the plan for Babs?
The first story has a definite ending, but she will be carrying on down that trail through the woods. She will be encountering more misfortune. Babs is a representative of my favorite kind of character, which I always sum up as great at the job but crap at life, and that has a high comedy potential.
Absolutely.
There's a long and glorious tradition there. I mean, the one that comes to mind, and it might not be an obvious one for a lot of people, is Justified, the TV series featuring Raylan Givens, played by Timothy Oliphant, who is absolutely brilliant, flawless at the job, but he's terrible at life. A million things go wrong for him every episode. And that's something that largely due to a lot of the fiction I grew up on, I tend to gravitate towards. So when I see a series like Justified, I will naturally glom onto it, and it all, that tradition feeds into what I do with something like Babs. I think there's a lot of fun to be had with someone who is, you might describe them as a very dangerous loser.
What I've never asked you before. What were some of the fiction that you read or saw or heard that influenced your writing?
Well, the one that comes to mind is a very old 2000 AD strip called Sam Slade, Robo Hunter, and this was my favorite comic strip for several years when I was a kid. It appeared in 2000 AD. It was created by John Wagner, who is most famous as the creator of Judge Dredd.
Sure.
The artist was Ian Gibson, co-creator, who is probably most famous as the co-creator of Halo Jones with Alan Moore, also for 2000 AD. Alan Grant, who was John's co-writer in a lot of these strips, was responsible for a good deal of the material. But Sam Slade, Robo Hunter, is, as he sounds, a sort of a future private detective who goes after rogue robots. And unlike most of the characters I was reading as a kid in 2000 AD and in Battle Action, who were quite high-minded, who were perhaps freedom fighters or wandering barbarians, or well, the obvious one is Judge Dredd, the almost automaton cop, or Strontium Dog, the tortured bounty hunter. Sam was just a guy doing a job, and all he wanted was really to make enough to pay the rent. I mean, he wanted a lot more than that, but he was realistic, and he knew that really his best chance was just not to get kicked out by his landlord that month. And so he did the job that he was good at. He was a robo hunter. And he ended up with a couple of idiot robot assistants who made sure that he would be very, very lucky if he achieved that very modest aim. And I always liked Sam because he was so unlike what I've called those high-minded characters that made up most of my comic reading youth, and indeed most people's comic reading youth. And Sam, I always liked this. When he eventually did hit it big, he quit. He was leaping up and down with joy, realizing that he was now rich enough to retire. And I thought, isn't that what most of us want? I mean, wouldn't we put aside our higher principles if we just had that chance to stop doing a terrible, terrible job that threatens your life on a daily basis, and you could just go off and live on a tropical beach and have people bring you drinks and enjoy yourself? And that's what happened to Sam. Now, it all went wrong later because of the aforementioned idiot assistants. But my point is that the idea of someone who's just in it for the money, someone who's just doing a job, that stayed with me. And it fed into that idea of the person who's really good at what they do, but terrible at life, what I call the dangerous loser. And that, 30 or 40 years later, made its way into Babs. Sorry, long-winded explanation, but that's how I got where I got.
No, I loved it. Am I wrong to assume as well, although it's a darker bunch of stories, that perhaps your Frank Castle is certainly a guy like that that's good at his job, but of course, complete crap at the 9 to 5, or just Monday.
Yeah, I mean, you might say that he's an extreme example in that he has absolutely given up on life. So there's no question. There's no question of him being crap at life because it was wrenched away from him in the ghastliest way possible. That that one day in Central Park, that ruins everything for him forever, and so therefore he has no choice but to embrace the job because it's the only way he can keep himself from blowing his own brains out. So Frank probably comes from a different tradition. He's driven. He has absolutely no choice at all. That is, as you say, a much darker tradition in terms of fictional characters.
Couple things, because really I did want to talk about your run on the Punisher, which of course we all love. And it really was epic. And also, even when it was either in the 616 or the Max books, it seemed like the same guy. Was that fair? That is, did you make any adjustments at all, if anything? Because the Max line came later, right?
Yeah,
you started with 616. So yeah, if anything, maybe it was an easier platform to tell harder stories. You tell me.
I think what it was I took the world away from the character. I took the Marvel Universe out and left it behind, and I took the character and I isolated him, and I put him in a setting as close to the real world as I could manage, and I started telling crime stories war stories sometimes, political stories that I felt suited the character better than anything the Marvel Universe could deliver. I honestly think that Frank doesn't fit terribly well in the Marvel Universe. He's a bad fit for it because everyone else has ultimately bloodless battles that result in no fatalities, or even if they do, the dead person will be back sometime fairly soon. But it's a multicolored world of wonder. Hell, it's called the Marvel Universe. In which a 70s crime movie inspired vigilante doesn't really fit because he can't do what he would obviously do in that setting. The things that would happen to him and that he would make happen don't fit there. And so the Max Punisher series was the ideal opportunity to simply put him where he belongs, in a world that suits him. Perhaps you might say, in a rather grim way, our world.
And the events of our world in the last couple of years, and I know I really don't know what your current feeling is, if you still have more Frank stories to tell, should the opportunity arise. But I wonder, because obviously there was that period of vigilantism just a couple of years ago, and I remember seeing that Time magazine article. It said maybe it's time for Marvel to retire the Punisher, and and that kind of attitude, to the point where now in the 616 there's a new guy that David Pepos created, and So do you think about what we went through as a society, and would that color any of the stories you potentially told, or are you like, man, I'm really glad my run, happened before all this reaction to, what's happening in the real world?
I am glad that my run happened before it, because it would have been very difficult if people's perception of the Punisher came crashing down in the middle of me trying to tell a 60-issue story. There's no doubt about that. But I do think that there's a bit of a distraction here. I do think that people blaming the Punisher for real world problems is at best misconstrued. I think that what you're actually seeing is a tendency people have nowadays, with the world as bad as it is. They develop a strong desire to feel as if they're making a difference. I don't blame them. Look at the state of the world. My God, it's awful.
Yeah.
You can look locally, nationally, internationally.
Yeah.
And it's awful. And everyone wants to think that they're making a difference to this. I'll be frank, it's a lot easier to get rid of a character like the Punisher than it is to try to enact actual social change that would mean that the real world events that I would argue are the genuine concern wouldn't be an issue. If, for example, you were to attempt to do something about enacting economic equality that would take Black people out of police gun sites, so that the idea of police officers wearing a Punisher symbol would become irrelevant, which it actually is. It is irrelevant. The idea that police officers wearing a Punisher symbol means they want to be the Punisher, I think is extremely dubious. They don't. Nobody wants to be the Punisher. Who wants to see their family slaughtered in front of them, to turn their back on everyday life, and begin a one-man war on crime, whatever the hell that means? Is it not the case that actually anyone wearing a Punisher symbol wants to wear a scary badge while they push suspects around and then go home to the wife and kids? And yet here we are, being asked to make our fiction pay for real world problems, as if getting rid of the Punisher, creating a new Punisher, making the old Punisher a sort of cosmic shepherd will somehow affect social change, so that the problems I've talked about are no longer problems. I find that absolutely ridiculous. I think, and this is something that goes back much further than the current controversy, I think fiction is once again being asked to answer for problems in the real world that are no fault of fiction. And I object to that. To answer your question in more practical terms, if Marvel said to me tomorrow, we would love you to come back and write The Punisher, I'd do it. I love writing The Punisher. If they said, we don't want you to do it with the skull symbol, I'd say, take out the skull symbol. It's not important. It's just a little bit of sort of visual sleight of hand. It's a symbol for the book, and in practical terms, it makes someone who's shooting at Frank shoot at his armored chest and not his unarmored head. That's like Batman's bat thing.
Absolutely.
That's all it is. But the idea that we can remove a fictional character and make the slightest difference to the real world, when we all know what has to happen in the real world to enact actual change, is, to me, ludicrous. Again, long way around the barn, but sorry, we got there.
Garth, I loved every bit of that, and truly, I am so with you as far as opinion as that goes. And I sometimes am like, it's fiction, it's a diversion. It's
fiction, and I don't like. And this is, like I said, it goes back, all the time I've been in comics and all the time before that. I don't like fiction being scapegoated. I really don't.
I respect that, absolutely, man. If you don't mind, while we're in this world, I own a page of Doug Brathwaite and Bill Reinhold in one of your stories.
Oh yeah,
absolutely. Oh, it's one of my favorite pages that I own, and that, and also I had Bill draw me your Fury as an old man, but in the Shield action suit, because I'm like, I suspect that if Fury was called to action, even as an old man, he could probably still pull it off. He's that kind of guy, which I always loved about your Fury stories and everything. And I know, was there, because I remember reading and hearing, and maybe we've talked about this before, that for a minute George Clooney was considering doing kind of a film Punisher, and then he read your Fury Max, and it's like, whoa, I don't know. I wondered if when Disney bought Marvel, was there any, did that happen during your run on Max Punisher, and the times you would use Fury, and were there any, again, guardrails put up, or were you able to do the kind of stories you wanted to do?
No one ever got in the way of that. The George Clooney story is one that I've been asked about a couple of times. I have my doubts. My suspicion would be that if anything like that happened, it probably went something like this. Someone might have mentioned Nick Fury to him, and he might have said, that sounds interesting. And then someone, movie stars have advisors, might have said, oh, there's a bit of controversy going on with the character at the moment. Maybe you might want to stay clear. And he went, oh yeah, maybe you're right. And that's it. If he actually sat down and read my Fury story, and the one would be the one that I'm still terribly fond of, that Derek Robertson drew about 25 years ago. I really liked that story. We had such a good laugh on that story. But if he actually read that, I'd be extremely flattered. I admire the guy. I like him as an actor and an activist. But I have my doubts. I really don't think he got anywhere near it. It's interesting you mention, the old guy Fury as the Marvel Universe Fury, because of course my introduction to the character was, and we were just talking about this, was the old Elektra Assassin series back in the 80s, when I think the first time you see Fury, he's sitting in a giant gun, like someone has built a handgun that's about 50 feet tall and 70 feet long, and he's sitting in it. It makes no sense whatsoever, but it's that Miller Sienkiewicz thing at their very, very best. That was my introduction to the character, where he was a sort of, first of all, he was old and grizzled, but also he was more of a spy master than a spy. He was the person who sent people out on missions.
Sure.
You did see a sort of burst of action from him. But that's where I first saw Nick Fury. The older stuff, while I'm aware of it, I wasn't aware of it at that time. This again is my weird introduction to American comics in my late teens, where everyone else, it was when they were 7 or 8. I didn't get to see that stuff until I was, I'd almost left high school.
I always appreciate hearing from people from Europe that read American comics and end up doing American characters, because it always feels like, because of how you guys grew up and women, that it's a different perspective. And I've had this conversation with James Robinson and a lot of other, people, Andy Diggle, people like that. And just, it's always interesting. Like, again, how this American product hits you, not growing up in the American culture, and to what degree the American culture, because obviously I understand a lot of our pop culture has traveled internationally, since the, at least the silence, good Lord, over 100 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is there, were there other superheroes that you felt you had a unique take on, that while you wrote superheroes that, you're like, I found an angle that, the usual suspects haven't found?
Well, my different experience is a little more different again than most Brits, like Andy, like James, because I saw almost no American comics at all as a kid. Certainly, the superhero tradition was pretty alien to me. It was just a quirk of distribution. Those comics were available, but in the funny little town outside Belfast that I grew up in, there was almost no access to them at all. You saw them occasionally. You saw their British reprints, but not often, and not regularly enough to really get a sense of them. And given that the British comics like Battle Action and 2000 AD and some of the war series like Commando and War Picture Library were readily available, and I could get those whenever I wanted, and could follow them with a coherence that my experience of American comics lacked. I just didn't bother with the superhero tradition. My old collaborator John McCrae, he lived in Belfast itself, and I suppose therefore the distribution was that bit better, and John was able to get his hands on things that I just couldn't. And what it meant was all I saw was British stuff. So my first American comics were, for instance, if you forget Mad Magazine, which I did see, but my first American comics were, my first Batman comic was The Dark Knight. In my late teens. My first introduction to the DC universe as a whole was what Alan Moore was doing on Swamp Thing. Again, my late teens. The Marvel universe was a little more of a mystery to me, but I got Elektra, and I went back and eventually got Frank Miller's Daredevil run, and I got Born Again, and I put it together the same way I did the DC universe. From Alan's work on Swamp Thing, but it was fragmentary, it was few and far between, and it was a weird way to encounter those worlds, because while I was familiar with the Batman characters from the old TV show, Adam West and so on,
sure,
Dark Knight is a strange first Batman comic. It really, so's Year One, which I managed to get hold of about a year later. These are all weird ways to encounter those fictional universes. And I would argue that given that Frank and Alan were probably doing the best work that it had ever been done on those characters at that up to that time. It gave me a very skewed view of mainstream American superhero comics, which is how I ended up writing about them the way I did.
Yeah, and in fact, that leads me to Hitman, obviously. And listen, man, I'm so glad you mentioned Battle Action, because I have every intention of talking about your current spin on it, and I'm so happy. And well, I'll save that. But truly, while we're on this superhero kick for a minute, was Hitman? Obviously, that was Hitman in terms of maybe a reaction to what you read, the way you and John did Hitman. And was that kind of a dress rehearsal for the ideas that were further explored in The Boys?
If it was a dress rehearsal, it was an accidental one, because I was not thinking about The Boys, which I wrote starting in 2005, when I was writing Hitman, which I began quite literally 10 years earlier. Hitman came out of The Demon.
Yes.
Which we did about 2 years on, John and myself. Hitman was supposed to be its own peculiar corner of the DC universe that universe very, very rarely intruded into. And we understood that we were going to have to use DC characters. We embraced the idea. I mean, if you look at Hitman #1, Batman is on the cover. And I remember John and I joking at the time that if we'd had to, we would have just had a massive shot of Batman and a little circled headshot of Hitman, and it would have been Hitman featuring Batman and Hitman. You know, you do what you have to. But I think on that series, DC Universe characters probably showed up about once a year, roughly speaking, until at a certain point they weren't showing up at all. And it was really supposed to be just an odd corner of that universe that you understood on some basic level existed in the same world as Batman, Superman, Catwoman, Etrigan, all the rest of them, but was really its own thing. It was a place that the other characters didn't really want to go. What probably held us closer to the DC universe than anything else was the fact that it was a Gotham City set story. And so every couple of years or every year, we would have to participate in those awful Batman crossovers at the time. Right. I've no problem telling you they were awful, because I happen to know that they were generated not by the Batman writers, Alan Grant, Chuck Dixon, and so on, but by the editorial team. And that's rarely a good idea. And it gave rise to stuff like there's an earthquake, there's a plague, there's for some reason America deserts Gotham and declares it a federal no man's land. And the thing about these, and I remember reading I'm digressing here, but I remember reading the editorial guidance for this stuff. And it would always talk about how after this things will never be the same again. And you would get to the last issue of this stuff, and Batman's wearing a slightly darker uniform. And it's like, that's it, is it? That's nothing will ever be this same again? Really? Anyway, that was the stuff that bolted us to the DC universe in a way that we might probably have preferred to have avoided, John and myself, but it did give rise to some good story ideas.
Well, that's good. Okay, I know I just talked to John a month or two ago, and I know there's a new collection, right, of the Hitman.
That's stuff. Right. Yeah, there's the first omnibus has just come out. It's a really lovely book, as those omnibu, which I believe is the preferred plural form, are known. The second one, which will complete the run, will be next year. And I'm happy to say that I've written a completely new story for that. It's a 12-pager, and it's the secret origin of Baitor. So if you've ever wondered why the weird little Baitor bloke shows up and screams, "I am Baitor," you'll find out why in this story.
Outstanding. That's great, man. Too much. Oh God! So that will that be in the second omnibus or
Yes, it
omnibus
will.
or whatever or
It
omnibus? Okay,
Yeah.
very good, man. That's terrific. Well, I appreciate the walk down memory lane. But now let's talk a bit about battle action.
Sure.
Now this was first of all, Garth, and I've told you this before, man. Ever since I think my first exposure to your war stuff was when you were doing war stories for Vertigo.
Yeah,
and it's always been your attention to detail, and truly, I'm one of those knucklehead Americans that we only know what television and film gave us as far as the rehashing of World War II. And truly, it's always a great education reading your stuff. And your version of Johnny Red, I'll bring up the cover and maybe a couple pages. Certainly no exception, man. I mean, and I've read you talk about your loving appreciation of the original run of runs like Johnny Red. So yeah, tell us about this.
Well, it's interesting that you highlight Johnny Red because I can't really pretend that my understanding of World War II was much better than yours. We can both only react to what we're given as kids, to the stories we're told as kids. You got Sergeant Rock and similar stories. The notion behind which is that America defeated Germany and Japan in World War II with some help from their allies.
Right.
I have to be honest and say that the British war comics I got as a kid didn't really wander too far from that idea. It was more that the British defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in World War II with some help from their American ally. In that sense, the story you were told was actually more accurate. But what neither of us were told was that Germany, the main enemy, was defeated by the massive sacrifices suffered by the Russian people.
Yep.
Who I think took something like 27 million dead in terms of casualties. The kind of number you can't fit it in your head, and inflicted, I think, something like 90% of German battlefield casualties. So in terms of defeating Nazi Germany, you have to give it to the Russians. Johnny Red is interesting in this regard because the editor of Battle, the old British 70s war comic, a guy called Dave Hunt, said to one of his top writers, Tom Tully, that he wanted to do a story about the Russian contribution in World War II because British kids didn't know anything about it. They weren't likely to be told about it because the Cold War was on at the time, and any Russian contribution to anything was deemed to be, well, the kind of thing that wasn't to be mentioned. They were the enemy.
Right.
We weren't supposed to talk about it. But Dave Hunt knew that it was an important part of the story. He was the editor of a war comic. The war comic was a little bit more realistic than what had been seen up to that time in that genre. And the right thing to do was to acknowledge the contribution of Russia. And he told Tom Tully this, and Tom Tully came up with Johnny Red. Johnny Red is the story of a British fighter pilot flying with and ultimately leading a Russian fighter squadron in World War II. Now, that's just the introduction to it. What it really is for the time, for the late 70s, a decent portrayal of the Russian sacrifice, of the incredible battles of Leningrad and Stalingrad and Kursk, of the price that the Russians paid to defeat what for them was the German invader. That's important. Germany invaded Russia. Britain got bombed, but never invaded. America suffered neither bombing nor invasion. Our two nations got off fairly lightly. The Russians did not. And I'm grateful that someone decided to, through the medium of comics, educate me in this particular reality. It's something that I've never forgotten, and that I've been able to, it's a vein that I've been able to mine in my own fiction ever since. But it all goes back to Johnny Red.
That's great, man. And I know you've done miniseries in the recent past as well with Keith Burns, right?
That's right.
Yeah, man. I'm gonna show his here. I'm gonna show his a great splash page of him with Johnny and everything. But yeah, great art for this, man. Love it. Talk about him.
He's I met Keith about 10 or 15 years ago. We were actually introduced to John McCrae. And Keith is the guy that I'd sort of been, in terms of war comics, I'd sort of been waiting to meet all this time. I needed someone for whom it wasn't just another job, someone who sort of lived and breathed this and dreamed this stuff the way I do. And it was Keith. It's funny that, you know, we were both Irish kids, me from the north, him from the south, growing up on British war comics, but we found our place producing those comics 30 or 40 years later. But you can see from the stuff you're showing there that he has an affinity for this material that very few people have. I've worked with great war comics artists like Cam Kennedy and Carlos Esquerra, but they're both known mostly for other material like Judge Dredd, like Rogue Trooper. Keith, as you can see, is first and foremost a war comics artist. He's the inheritor of, on your side of the pond, Joe Kubert and Russ Heath. On mine, John Cooper and Joe Colquhoun. I mean, he is the best war comics artist currently working. He's also a member of the Guild of Aviation Art.
Wow.
And has exhibited, you know, some wonderful, wonderful paintings in their galleries. But, you know, the short version is I'm extraordinarily lucky to have him, because writing war stories, you need someone who's going to draw the stuff the way and understand it the way you understand it when you're writing it. And here he is.
Unbelievable stuff, man. It's gorgeous. And the attention to detail, you know, as I'm sure you know, we all love Jack Kirby and we all love his art, but I know when it came to war stuff, he'd kind of go his own way. You know, he'd kind of get creative in what he drew and stuff. But it's pretty obvious that in Kate's case, that there's a serious attention to detail. And
I think so.
Yeah. Do you have models of these, you know, World War II airplanes and things? I'm assuming that he does. And if not, he's got to have amazing photo reference stuff to go by to come up with these images.
Yeah, we both do. Although in Keith's case, it's very much a practical thing. He needs them so that he can literally hold the airplane model up in his hand and look at it from different angles and shine the light on it in different ways and so on. I mean, that's absolutely vital for him. He's told me that he's tried to use 3D digital models, but it's just not the same.
Interesting. Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. You know, Garth also, and I imagine, because, yeah, I mean, this is an old hobby going back decades and everything, but if not centuries. I've gone into some of these stores that sell military vehicles and soldiers and things for you to kind of have a little layout, kind of like a model railroad thing, but obviously it's battles. First of all, oh my God, that stuff is ridiculously expensive. And I understand, because the attention to detail is insane. But yeah, I mean, is that where you get your stuff, or, you know, or are you buying the old fashioned models and sniffing the airplane glue while you're putting stuff together?
Sniffing glue, of course. But I don't need models to do that.
That's true. That's true.
For me, it's more, the research is more in the literature. I don't need to know exactly what the thing looks like. I mean, I have a decent idea. But Keith is the one who actually needs to have a proper sense of the weight that an object, let's say like a tank or an aeroplane or an artillery gun or a truck, occupies in the world. Interesting thing, actually. I mean, models are very useful, and Keith, I think, finds them particularly helpful for his art. But what you cannot beat is seeing the thing in the real world. And just a few weeks ago, Keith and myself and some of our fellow aficionados were at Duxford in England, where we were able to see a lot of the original aircraft fly.
Wow.
And nothing beats seeing the pilot climb into the airplane, and a few seconds later, the engine cough out fire and smoke, and the propeller start to spin, and the plane taxi off out to the runway and so on. Yeah, that's always been a very special moment. Actually, seeing that, and for Keith, probably more helpful than anything else.
These are over 80-year-old aircraft, right?
Yeah.
Jesus, that's amazing.
In some cases, if you go back to World War One, some of them are over 100.
Wow.
We saw a Fokker triplane fly that day. We saw an SE-5, a Sopwith Camel, an Albatross, heavily rebuilt, obviously. But seeing them actually take to the air is a special moment.
That's amazing, man. Absolutely. And the Johnny Red story reminds me, and I really only became aware of it in my late high school, early college years. But the fact that Johnny is flying with the Russians kind of reminds me of the Chinese Tigers, or the Flying Tigers, excuse me.
Flying Tigers,
yeah, the Flying Tigers in that late 30s period before America entered the war. But we had American pilots, flying with the Chinese and stuff.
That's right. Yeah. The Flying Tigers are an interesting group because while there were definitely American pilots, technically mercenaries, flying with the Chinese Air Force in the late 30s, before World War II, as we understand it, had kicked off, before America had joined the war after Pearl Harbor. The Flying Tigers didn't actually see action until after Pearl Harbor.
I didn't know that. Oh, wow.
And in fact, a couple of the veterans have said that rather than being mercenaries, they were a covert American military operation, because they were recruited directly out of the U.S. military, out of the Navy, the Army. There was no separate Air Force at the time, and the Marine Corps. One of them said that the ship that took them down there, that actually left the U.S. and took them to China, was escorted by the U.S. Navy. They sent warships along to sort of discreetly shadow them. How true that is, I don't know. But while they were definitely intended to fly with the Chinese Air Force, they did not, in fact, see action until after Pearl Harbor. But it was a very cosmopolitan time for air forces. You had Americans flying for the Chinese. You had Americans and many pilots as refugees from the conquered European nations flying with the British Royal Air Force. You had many Axis nations sending their pilots to fly alongside the Germans, and so on. People found their way into the sky to aerial combat by all sorts of roads and in all sorts of ways. It was an odd time in that regard.
And I guess that makes sense then in terms of comic series like Black Hawk and the international group that the Blackhawks represented and everything. Very cool, man. No, and again, I'm loving this current Johnny Red story. And Garth, you're also editing Battle Action for Rebellion as well as writing the Johnny Red thing, or what's going on? Tell me.
Not exactly. The editor is a guy called Oliver Pickles, who's a tremendous bloke and one of the best editors I've ever worked with. He and I sort of confer on stuff, but the final decision is his, really. Okay. I just advise. Once we brought in new writers, I definitely took a step back in that regard. The first one shot where I wrote all 7 stories, yes, I took more of a direct role, But once we brought in people like Rob Williams, Torrin Grunbeck, interestingly, both of whom were at Duxford.
Oh, that's great.
On the day, yes.
Yeah.
Fellow aviation nuts. Once we brought in people like them and John Wagner, one of the original Battle Action writers, in fact, one of the original co-creator with Pat Mills of Battle in 1975. When we brought back writers like that, I consciously took a step back because I wanted to focus on my own stuff, but I don't want to get in the way of people like Rob and Torrin and John and Dan Abnett and many of the writers that we've brought in for the third series, like, my God, Brian Vaughan.
Yeah. No, I know. I just talked to Chris Burnham, who drew that Brian K. Vaughan story.
Right.
Yeah. And, Chris is a trip. I love Chris. He's one of my favorite guys. No, honestly, man, it is so great that it's back. And is the plan an ongoing series? And how well is it doing? Your issue 2, everybody, comes out at the end of October, as I understand it. And
yes.
So tell they were kind enough to send me both the first and second issue, and it looks reads fantastic, looks amazing. Both features in Battle Action and everything. But is the plan for it to be an ongoing?
We'll have to wait and see. This third series is 10 issues.
Okay.
As you know, there's a Johnny Red episode in every issue, which will make up I think 140-page graphic novel eventually. So every issue has Johnny Red alongside a one-shot by another writer and artist team. I've done a couple. I've done Dredger with John Higgins, Hellman with Mike Dory. Torrin's back. She's writing Nina Petrova with Patty Goddard on the art. Rob is doing Major Easy again and El Mestizo. We've got Dan Abnett. He's doing Death Game 1999. Steve White, a dear friend, and yet another Duxford attendee, is doing Hookjaw, the killer shark story. We've crammed as much into this 10-issue series as we can. Will there be more? I hope so. What form it will take, we will have to wait and see.
Garth, I remember the first time you and I talked about war books was when Dead Reckoning printed Tankies, I want to say.
Yeah.
And again, another great series. Are you finding homes for your war stories? I mean, and people are like, hey, well, we'll take a chance. And, again, your body of work speaks for itself. But I mean, it's, war is not the easiest sell the way superheroes or the way horror has certainly exploded in the last 20 years. So I mean, how marketable is the war stuff?
Well, I would say separately from Battle Action, which is its own thing, the war stories, each one tends to do well enough for me to do another one. Coming early in the new year, you'll see a book called Partisan, which is a follow-up to Sarah, the story I did with Steve Epting a few years ago. And this is another Russian front story. But whereas Sarah was about a trained killer, an extremely capable sniper, this is a story about a Russian housewife who, after the German invasion, finds herself really, to protect her children, fighting with the Russian resistance. She has very little choice in this. She has no knowledge of what's required of her. She's thrown in at the deep end. All she knows is she has to do whatever it takes to keep her children alive. And this graphic novel will be the story of this simple, ordinary, everyday woman who finds herself with a gun in her hands, fighting the German invader. It's Steve Epting again on art, as I say. It's published by TKO, as I say.
Great.
I think if you like my war stories, I think you're really going to like this one. It's one I'm very pleased with.
I'm going to keep my eyeballs open, Garth. It'll be an excuse to get you back in a few months and talk about that. That would be amazing. I'm thrilled that Rebellion is rolling the dice with Battle Action. And again, I think this Johnny Red lead story is great. His rival that shows up at the end of issue 1, and we see him in issue 2. Is that and again, you'll forgive me, but I only know so much about British war characters. Is that an old character you've brought back? Is that new for this story?
In a way, in the very first episode of Johnny Red, published in 1977, Johnny gets kicked out of the British Royal Air Force for punching an officer after an accident, an aerial accident. And you never see the pilot who actually caused the accident. He's just called Mike. All you're told is that Mike seems to be a little bit more devil may care than Johnny. Johnny is a working class guy from the wrong side of the tracks. He's trying to keep his nose clean to do the right thing. But he gets blamed for the accident that this guy Mike has caused. You never see Mike. And I thought, what if we brought Mike back? What if we brought back a character that was never actually seen by the audience? You see his aeroplane, you see the accident he causes. And what if he'd achieved senior rank? And what if he finally decided to try and do right by our hero, to do something to make up for the fact that he got Johnny kicked out of the Air Force, and yes, set him on his life's course as Johnny Redburn, as the Red Devil, as the British hero of the Russian skies. But what if we actually sort of fleshed out that character, gave him bones, and showed him trying to make amends for what he'd done? Now, as you've read it.
Yes.
You've read the first couple of issues, so you know that it doesn't begin very well because Johnny hits him as hard as he possibly can. But after that, when Mike starts to explain what he's got in mind, Johnny at least has the presence of mind to listen.
Every issue, man, and I don't know, there's something about you Brits when it comes to, and maybe because of that 2000 AD format of having to give a lot of story in a small space. Both chapters have been very satisfying, and no, you've got my attention. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the story. It's terrific. And again, everybody, issue 1 out now, and in just a couple weeks, really, 2 Wednesdays from now, October 30th, you'll see the next issue 2 of Battle Action. Very cool stuff, man. No, I'm thrilled for you. As we wrap up, I suppose I got to ask what's going on with the boys and you. Anything brewing?
Well, let's see. I'm starting to see the scripts for the 5th season. Gen V proceeds along its course. And
I love that miniseries. That was so fantastic. And really to then present a new series with a whole bunch of characters. I mean, yeah. I give it up to Kripke and company. Those are amazing. Keep going.
Yeah, Eric really seems to have the gift of keeping these things going. His experience on his previous show, I think, demonstrates that. But I've read the first couple of scripts also of the next spin-off, which will be the 50s set show. And they're very special indeed. I mean, that's a period of history I find particularly interesting, and their take on it is, I think it's one that won't disappoint.
Is that going to be Jensen Ackles as Soldier Boy, and kind of we're going to see Soldier Boy in the 50s?
Yeah.
That's cool. That's great. And potentially, especially it being set in the 50s, it makes me think of that Howard Chaykin, David Tishman, American Century series that came out during the 90s. And I don't know. And again, I don't want you to spoil, and I'm not going to ask you to, but for people who know, kind of the dirty tricks that America was doing covertly in areas like South America and some of the other areas of the world, and what the CIA was doing with some dirty tricks and phony companies that were operating in some of these areas and stuff. And really, they were just there to be kind of intelligence operations and things. So no, I wonder.
I think that's definitely a part of it. But I think the starting point for the show will be that, just as in the real world, American intelligence pulled a great deal of rocket science out of what was left of Nazi Germany.
Sure.
We can assume that they'll in the show they'll pull a great deal of superhuman science, because that is of course where it all started.
Yeah, the Operation Paperclip, right? The various eugenics experiments that the Germans were doing for the master race. Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Oh man, you got me excited. That's cool. Is it inspiring any ideas for you to write some comic stories?
Not really in that regard. I think my time with the boys in terms of writing the comic is, if not past, then on hold. If I was to go back, I might focus more on a couple of characters from the boys themselves. But for the moment, I'm happy to just leave it to the TV show to explore that world. I mean, I'm concerned with battle action and with Babs, and if Marvel did give me the go ahead tomorrow, the Punisher, but it's all new comics for me at the moment.
Fair enough. Have you noticed any sort of, because the great example, of course, was Walking Dead, and the television, success that it had has obviously been able to dovetail back to the comics.
Yeah.
And make Kurtman and Charlie some nice money as well on the books. Have you experienced that with the boys? Wonderful, great to hear.
Yeah,
that's excellent, man.
It's been nice because it's nice to see the success of the show, but it's nice to see the comic itself, the one that Derek and I created, nearly 20 years ago, and that I worked on with him and with Russ and with John McCrae. It's nice to see it gain some benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And no, again, that's we all us nerds are like, God, we really hope that they'll read the books after seeing the movies or seeing the TV show. So I'm glad to hear that's happening for you. But John, as you said, your plate is full right now. You've got here, everybody. Once again, there's Battle Action. That's the first issue. Issue 2 coming very soon, October 30th, and I'll bring back the Babs first issue to show everybody as well. Very funny stuff, man. A tremendous. If you like, and it's so ironic, man, because Gail Simone's Red Sonja book novel is coming up in a month or so. So Babs will have some nice company on the on the bookshelf.
No, but there you go. You can't have too many female barbarians. Let's face it.
John, honestly, or John, Garth. I apologize.
You're John.
I'm John. I was thinking McCrae. I know. I gotta check my underwear and see what it says stenciled for camp. Exactly. So that was an American tradition. If you don't know what I'm talking about.
No, I know.
All right, good. I don't know what travels across country or not. Garth, honestly, I love talking to you, and it really means a lot that you come back. And it's always great to hear about new stuff from you. And Babs and Battle Action are absolutely delivering, everybody. So some great Garth Ennis book stuff. And in a couple of months, a new graphic novel, him and Steve Epting. So perhaps a reason to reconvene in a few months and have a new conversation, I hope.
Happy to, John. All right, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, man. No, thank you very much. As we wrap up, I'll let everybody know that coming up this week on Word Balloon, Kelly Thompson is going to rejoin us, talking about Absolute Wonder Woman and Birds of Prey and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I hope you'll join us then. Until next time, everybody stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.